Welcome back from Chavruta. I hope you all enjoyed. It was fun going into the rooms, hearing some ideas that people had, some things that I hadn't thought about, which is always what's nice about Chavruta. Gets you to think about all sorts of ideas. I know most of you, I assume, did not finish the sources, which is all fine and good. The idea is to really spend the time thinking about what you're learning. And I know that a lot of the groups did that, so that's great. Okay, let's get to our topic. I know some people said they were struggling, that they still didn't have the answer to why the Kohen Gadol's death is what causes the release of the accidental killers. And I will tell you that even if you did make it to the end of the daf, you might notice that there's really no clear-cut answers. And it's something that not only did we struggle with, the commentary struggled with as well. And it's actually a really big question, what exactly is going on here? So if you notice already from the psukim, I highlighted all the mentions of high priest. This was really to prepare you for what the Gemara was going to do, which was find in the numbers here, the number of references to the death of the Kohen Gadol, to find in the numbers the support for the different opinions in the Mishnah. So I'm not going to read through the psukim because that's less critical to me, but now we're going to start with the Mishnah. So again, I defined for you here to make it easy for you the different types of Kohanim Gedolim. So one gets anointed with a special oil that you might have already seen in Rashi, that in the time of Yoshiyahu, the king, which was toward the end of the time period in Sefer Melachim, Yoshiyahu, basically, they hide this oil and they put it away because they could see that the destruction was coming and they wanted to kind of protect it, and it was never seen since then. So there is someone who gets appointed by the special oil. Then there's one who's initiated by wearing the 8 special priestly garments, right? The regular Kohanim had 4 garments. The Kohen Gadol had 8. So the way that they would initiate people when they didn't have the special oil, which according to Rashi was historical, there was the first time period where it was everyone was anointed. Then you move into the time period where you would basically put on the garments, and that would be your initiation into the job. And then everyone would know he's the Kohen Gadol. Then we have someone who is a temporary stand-in, which, as you can imagine, right? The Kohen Gadol might get sick or something would happen. The issue would be more tamei. He becomes impure and he can't work. So they put someone else in his stead. Now, once you do this, and you will learn Masechet Yoma might remember this, you always retain your status. You're still considered a Kohen Gadol. So all these 3 are mentioned in the Mishnah by what we call the Tanakama. And I realized from some questions that I forgot to explain what Tanakama is. Many of you might know, but many of you might not know. So Tanakama is always when you have a Mishnah and it starts off without saying so-and-so said. And only later do you have so-and-so said. So the first Tana, that's literally Kama means first. The first Tana is called the Tanakama, and he's anonymous. And it's usually representative of the rabbi's opinion, the main opinion. And then we end up with an individual who argues with the Tanakama. Sometimes Tanakama ends up being an individual's opinion as well. Once in a while, you'll see the Gemara question, who is that Tanakama? Who is the person who said this? And then they try to bring other Tanaitic sources that line up with that person. And then they say, oh, it was obviously this particular person and not the general accepted opinion. Okay, then we have Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, it's not just those 3, but it's even the Kohen who's appointed to go out and tell the people before they go to war. There's a whole speech that's given in the Torah where he says, if you just got married, if you just built a vineyard, if you just built a house, you get to have time where you get to basically be, just 1 second. Okay. So you basically have time to go home and you don't have to go out to war. Or if you're scared, you don't have to go out to war. And he makes this big speech. That's a little bit different. Number one, it's not dynastic. It doesn't go from father to son, that position. So maybe that affects things because maybe there's something about continuity, that the death of the Kohen Gadol maybe has to do with the continuity. And that's why Tanakama doesn't think that he belongs in this list, right? You have to think about why Tanakama thinks he doesn't belong in the list. I thought of a few ideas. Put it in here. You can see here. Where did I say it? Here. Answer sheet. No, it's not here. I lost it. Okay. Anyway, let's move back up. Sorry. Here's my thoughts that I wrote here. So I wrote that number one, he's in a leadership position, but he's actually not a Kohen Gadol. So, right, a Kohen Gadol is the Kohen Gadol. So it could be that because he's not actually the Kohen Gadol, Rabbi Yehuda didn't think that he belonged here. Second option is it's not an inherited position, as I said before. And the other issue is that maybe someone who deals with war, I actually thought that maybe this was exactly what the debate was about. One who deals with wartime issues, where unfortunately, as we know in war, there's many accidental deaths. And it could be that Rabbi Yehuda was saying, who more appropriate and relevant than the one who goes out to war, who sees this all the time? On the other hand, you might say, maybe he's not the right person to deal with this because he's in a scenario where this happens a lot. And maybe he's the war kind, and maybe he has, responsibilities of death and all that. And maybe he's not the one whose death should really be the one to atone for. And maybe that's the rabbi's opinion. So again, rabbi is synonymous with Tanakam here. So there's different opinions as to why, and we don't really know the reason for what the basis of the machloket is. In fact, if you got to the Gemara, you saw that the basis of the machloket was really how many times it appears in the verse. And we'll get there momentarily. Maybe we'll actually skip to there right now for a minute, which is when you get to the Gemara on this debate, the Gemara says, Menahan and Mile. Where do we get these words from, right? Where is it from? Menahan and Mile is usually a question that the Gemara wants to know what is the source for what the Mishnah said, because the Mishnah is a nice, very organized and simple book. And what it doesn't tell us, so while it might be a lot easier to learn than Gemara, but it doesn't tell us the sources of all of what it says. It usually, once in a while, you'll have a verse, but usually it doesn't. And Gemara, usually the first question the Gemara often asks is, where do you get this from? What's the source? And instead of giving an answer, which would be a descriptive answer, well, it makes more sense that he would be the one or blah, blah, blah. No, the Gemara, in fact, brings psukim, and it's really a numbers game. And this is one of those drashot that you probably imagine they really had the answer to begin with, and they just wanted to connect it to the verses so that you remember you had a mnemonic device. It can't really be, I don't think, that this was really what their debate was about, how many times it appears in the Torah. And this comes up a lot in debates where they use this as a method, but it's probably not, right? There's always a question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the halakha or the drasha, right? Is it that they saw it in the text and they said, oh, from here we must get the halakha? Or they knew the halakha and they wanted to connect it to a verse? So the answer in this question is sometimes this way, sometimes that way. So this kind of drasha is not your best drasha because it's really not content-oriented, it's number-oriented. Okay, so it says, Vayeshev Mot Kohen Gadol. It says, Ki be'ir miklato, he'll sit until the Mot Kohen Gadol. It says, and after the death of the Kohen Gadol, that's 3. Rabbi Yehuda says there's another one. It says, Lashuv Lashevet Ba'aretz Mot Kohen. And I want to just show you here for a quick moment. I'm going to skip now to the Gemara. If you look in the Gemara and you were using the regular Gemara, Menahan and Mile, so you'd see here, number 7, number 8, number 9, and then number 10 here. And you would look on the side and it tells you exactly where all these verses appear. So you might not have needed that because you saw the verses before, but if you hadn't looked at the psukim before, you would have used this guide of the Torah, or which helps tell you exactly where to find all these verses. Okay, so now the last thing to do in this section of the Gemara before we go, I didn't mean to stop sharing, before we go back to the end of the Mishnah, is this one last line in this Gemara is v'idach. Now, v'idach is a question that comes up very, very often in the Gemara. And what happens is you have two people arguing, two different opinions, and this one brings his pasuk, and that one brings his pasuk, and then you end up, if you know me, you know that I always call it a ping-pong conversation. I'm not the only one who uses this term. Everybody uses it when they learn Gemara. It's a ping-pong because it's a back and forth. And it says, what do you do with his verse? And what do you do with his verse? And what do you do with his verse? In our case, we don't end up with a long ping pong, but we end up with an idach, which is, if Rabbi Yehuda proves it from the pasuk, L'shuv L'shevet Ba'aretz Mot Kohen, then you really end up with 4 psukim discussing the death of the Kohen. So what's the Tanakama going to do with that pasuk? To which the Gemara answers, Midelo Ktiv Hagadol. Notice, one word is missing, and this pasuk is different from all the others, because it only says Kohen and it doesn't say Kohen Gadol. It's just a pasuk that's referencing one of the previous, and it's not really adding anything new. And that's what the rabbis would say to Rabbi Yehuda's extra pasuk. In this case, there's no need for a big ping pong back and forth because we can resolve it right there. Okay, now we're going to get to I would say, the more interesting part of our daf, which is, what is this last line in the Mishnah? So I know some of you told me you spent a long time on it, and I apologize if you spent a long time on it because it was a bit of a, sorry, I'm trying to get back to the place. It was a bit of a trick question, I have to admit, because this word lefichach, and I really wanted you to notice that it doesn't really fit here. And I wanted you to do careful reading of text, because if you read the text without being careful, you'd say, okay, we have 3 according to 1. Then Rabbi Yehuda adds a 4th. And then we get this extra line about the mothers of the Kohanim would provide food and clothing in order that nobody would be praying for their sons to die. And then you'd say, okay, fine, new halacha, another point in the Mishnah, move on. But if you do careful reading, you see this word lefichach, and you say, what's that word lefichach doing there? What does it have to do with? Lefichach means, and therefore. Now, and therefore what? Starting from, right? We have a debate in the Mishnah. The topic of our Mishnah until this point is which Kohanim Gedolim, the death of which, right? If you hadn't read this Mishnah, I'm sure you all would have told me it's the functioning Kohen Gadol, the one, right? The one and only Kohen Gadol who basically serves the main function in the temple. And the truth is that according to Rashi, there really only is kind of one, right? Because the Mashuach B'Shem and HaMishkan, the Merubah B'Gadim, are really just coming from different time periods. And according to Rashi, right, it's either you have the Shem and HaMishkan because you're living before Yoshiyahu, or you're living after Yoshiyahu and you have the Merubah B'Gadim. Maybe on an off chance you have someone who's a bar mimashichuto, okay? But the Ritva disagrees with Rashi. I didn't bring you all these sources. I'm just going to tell you them outside. The Ritva says that it's not a historical thing that at one point it was the Shem and HaMishkan, and at a later point it became the Merubah B'Gadim. He said that before Yoshiyahu, everyone agrees that once Yoshiyahu put away that oil, we never had it again. But he says before Yoshiyahu, there were 2 ways to become a Kohen, and you could have become a Kohen Gadol with the Merubah B'Gadim. And there were certain instances where you would or wouldn't, and if someone, I'm not going to get into all the details, but he actually goes against Rashi from a number of sources that seem to prove, and he brings source by source, that seems to show that they could be coexisting at the same time, because there's cases where they choose one over the other, and then they have to be living at the same time, otherwise it makes no sense. So on that basis, he rejects Rashi. And according to the Ritva, sorry, I don't know why I moved that, according to the Ritva, you theoretically could have a number of Kohanim Gedolim operating at the same time. And the Aruch LaNer, who's an Achron, living much later, the Ritva is a Rishon in Spain, and the Aruch LaNer, who's much later, comes and gives a very interesting explanation of lefichach, and I wanted to share it with you. So I wanted you to think about the question before and see how difficult it is, and then see what he has to say. First of all, someone pointed out in the Chavruta that it says Kohanim, and it doesn't say Kohanim Gedolim. And maybe it's the mothers of all the Kohanim were praying, which I had never thought about, which I thought was very interesting. I checked after she said it, and I looked up and I saw one of the commentaries point out that why Kohanim in plural, and this really matches what the Aruch LaNer is saying. It's the Kohanim of all again, there's different interpretations. It's possible there's many. The Kohanim are the Kohanim mentioned in this Mishnah. And you could have a bunch of Kohanim all at the same time. And then what he says is basically, the mothers will be jealous of the others. And that if there's a number of Kohanim Gedolim, then basically each mother is going to want to protect her own son. Because, let's say, assuming, right, the assumption of this whole thing, which is a crazy assumption, we're going to talk about that also, which is that all the accidental killers are hoping for the death of the Kohen Gadol, right? I thought of it kind of like the way you want your teacher to be sick, so that you have off from school. Like they want to get out of this town and they know the only way out is having the Kohen Gadol die. So presumably they're going to be praying for his death. So the lefichach, according to the Aruch LaNer, is since there's multiple ones, they want to kind of win him over to their side so that they won't pray for this one, they'll pray for a different one, which is also an interesting interpretation. But again, the question, I always like to say, is much better than the answer. And that word lefichach is actually quite complicated and not so clear what it's doing there. Okay, so now, I by the way, I summarized this all. So you can read it all over in the answers sheets, which will be put up on the site. And you should be able to read this later if you would like. Okay, so we went through the first section of the Mishnah. Now we're going to go to the second source of the Mishnah. So here I brought you Rashi just to make sure that you understood that these were different psukim, and he just kind of spells things out a little bit more clearly. Now we're going to move to the real meat and potatoes of today's daf, which is Lefichach imotehan shel kohanim. And this Gemara is quite complicated, but we're going to read through it together. There's two versions of the Mishnah we're going to learn. The version of our Mishnah that we're reading is only one version. So what we had is that the mothers feed them. Okay, by the way, there's a bunch of different options as to why they're feeding them and giving them drink. Is it that they're going to feel aligned? And this is kind of what the Aruch LaNer said. They're going to feel aligned to one particular Kohen because his mother's been feeding them, and therefore, maybe pray for the other Kohen, which is interesting to think these mothers are kind of, self-interest, which most mothers do have self-interest, care about their children living more than they care about other people's children, and therefore, trying to avoid them praying for others. Or we can understand it simply kind of ignoring the word lefichach. They're just trying to get people not to be praying for their death. But the question is, how is they going to prevent their death, number one? And it's just because they like them and the mothers are doing nice things for them, right? They're kind of bribing them into saying, well, I guess it would be really not nice if we prayed for her son to die after she did all these nice things for us. That's one option. Another possibility is that they wanted to make their lives so comfortable in the Ir Miklat. And I think as women who often, are stuck with the burden of having to prepare dinner every night and having to, or if they're men, I'm sure in those days, the men had to bring money home to pay for the food in the house. And here you kind of get everything handed to you on a silver platter. And you think, you know what, this isn't too bad, right? Maybe this is a nice life. And maybe, okay, so I'm exiled from my hometown, but at least I'm getting taken care of. You think about in prison, right? Certain people would rather live in prison. It's easier for them, right? They had trouble making a living outside of prison. Here they get food and drink, and it's not exactly pleasant, but there's certain things that are taken care of for you. And maybe that's what the mothers were trying to get at. But now the really interesting part and the theological part of today's daf comes in. What's the assumption? There's a lot of assumptions about what this whole situation. First of all, the assumption is the mothers are concerned that people are praying that their sons are going to die. Interesting to think that people use prayer to pray for people's death, right? Now, whether the mothers, one of the questions I really thought about is, are the mothers in touch with reality? Are people really praying for their son's death? Or are they just worried that people are praying for their son's death? There's a big difference, right? And even if people are praying for their son's death, does that mean their son's going to die just because some crazy people in the Ir Miklat are praying for the death of their son? Is that the way prayer works? That somebody prays for their son and, oh yeah, the son's now going to die because of that? That seems a little bit strange. So the Gemara assumes, and I want to point this out as an assumption that you don't have to take, but the Gemara assumes, based on our version of the Gemara, that ta'ama de lo matzlu, right? The reason is that then they wouldn't pray. But the assumption is that hamatzlu, that if they did pray, maite. The clear assumption, the Gemara says from the Mishnah, is that if people prayed for the Kohen Gadol to die, he would die. And that's why the mothers took action and tried to prevent that from happening. Now, again, I want to suggest it could be the mothers were just worried about it. It doesn't necessarily mean it would happen. Mothers worry about lots of things. Fathers worry as well, right? There's lots of things you could worry about. It doesn't mean that it's a legitimate worry, or it could be legitimate, but not, it doesn't mean it's really going to happen. But the Gemara takes this at face value, which is just interesting in terms of the Gemara likes to kind of, it says this, it must mean exactly that. So the Gemara then goes up and says, wait a minute. If I'm an accidental killer and I'm in the Ir Miklat and I pray for the Kohen Gadol's death, he's going to die. And then it says, and why is this absurd? And the tactic they use often is, let's quote a verse from the Tanakh. In this case, it happens to be a verse in Proverbs, which again, if you look back at the Gemara, right, you can see it's here, Kid Sipor Lanu Kidror La'uf, and then you look here in the Torah, and it tells you Mishlei chapter 26, Kavav, Pasuk Bet. So the verse says the following: Kitsipor lanud, kidror lauf, like a bird that wanders, like a bird who flies. A curse that's baseless is not going to go anywhere, right? The bird flies around, doesn't really go anywhere. Okay. Likewise, a baseless curse is not going to go anywhere. So basically, they say This assumption of the Mishnah is totally incorrect. How could it possibly be that if they would pray for a death of someone who doesn't deserve to die, that they're going to die? To which Amrahu Saba, an elderly man, gets up and says, Mi Pirkei de Rava Shmiali, I heard it from the Pirkei de Rava. Okay, by the way, just in terms of punctuating, because I didn't really mention this, but Ta'ama always comes to say the reason is this, and then Ha, and it doesn't always, but in this kind of situation, they're basically deriving something, and they're saying the reason is this, Ha, but therefore, if it was something else, it would be different. Okay, and you can see the comparison of the Delo Matzle and the Matzlu, okay, where we're basically comparing something is, something isn't. So that's how you know that you're going to end, right? You're going to put commas there and you're going to end there. And then the Haktiv is always a Ktiv, we learned last week, whenever it says Haktiv, they're going to quote a Pasuk. And the Ha before, whether it's Ktiv or Tanya or any of that, is usually, it's a word of strength, which often is a question. But doesn't it say, sometimes it could be the Haktiv and it says, and it's proving it. But usually it's used as a question. So doesn't it say this, which would basically mean no way, no how? To which this Saba comes in, and this often happens, where all of a sudden you have an elderly gentleman, because they're usually very wise, or in this case, he happened to learn in the lecture of Rava, and he says, in the lecture of Rava, I heard, it's like a tradition, I learned, they're responsible. Why are they responsible? They should have prayed for mercy for their generation. For what did they pray for mercy? That accidental murders didn't happen. And because they didn't do their job as the leaders of the people, and they didn't pray for mercy that accidental murders wouldn't happen, they're also responsible. It's not that they're fully responsible, but that means they're also responsible, which means that they could die. And if the people pray for them to die, they're worthy of dying. Okay, they're deserving of death because they also did something pretty bad. It's interesting because the guy who goes to the refuge city doesn't die, but the Kohen Gadol could theoretically die for this. Version 2 of the Mishnah is a little bit different. Ika de matne. Ika usually introduces, Ika means yesh, there are, but when it comes to Ika de matne or Ika de amre, there are those who say, there are those who learn, matne means learn in a Tanaitic source, which means there are those who had a different version of our Mishnah, because that's the Tanaitic source we were dealing with. And instead of saying the mothers would give them food and drink so that they don't pray for their sons to die, which the whole thing seems strange. People pray for other people to die, and that works also. In other words, the combination of, number one, it seems crazy. Yeah, I know you want your teacher to be sick, but people don't generally pray. I pray my teacher's sick and doesn't come to school. You know, maybe I pray she decides to take the day off, but not get sick, right? Or it's already a big difference. So now this version has it different. And it says, Kedei sheyitpalalu al bneihem shelo yamutu. They would do it not for the negative to prevent them from praying, but in the positive. She wanted them to love her and want to do anything for her, that they would then pray for their sons that they wouldn't die. Okay, so this resolves this issue of people praying for other people to die. And does that work? Like if I pray for someone's death, they're going to die. So it's much better. Now it's saying they're praying so that she's doing these nice things for these people, these murderers, so that they try to help keep her son alive. However, there's a weird assumption there. Wait a minute. Tama de matzlu, halo matzlu maite. Wait a minute. Again, we're going to have this same structure. Okay, it's going to be the same structure, but different wording. The reason here is that if they pray, they can help save him from dying. The underlying assumption, though, is that halo matzlu, but if they don't pray, what will happen to the Kohen Gadol? What's the default? The default is he's going to die. My havalei l'me'abad. What's their responsibility? Now, it's the same type of question, but this is much stronger because there, in the first version, the default was the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to die. It's only if people pray for his death will he die. In this version, they're going to hold him much more liable because they're going to say without any prayer, the Kohen Gadol should really end up dying. And why should he die? My havalei l'me'abad. What should he do? He's not the one who murdered. And this time, okay, I want you to see the difference. In the first version, the question was brought from a pasuk. In this case, they don't have a pasuk. What do? They bring it from the word on the street. These are adages that people would say. Okay, so, and it's funny, they bring here is always in the Bavli, it's Babylonia, and Hatam is there in Israel. So we're now going to compare the wording of this adage in Israel and the wording of it in Babylonia. It doesn't really matter. It's just pointing out that we all have ways, the expressions we use. And sometimes, in England, they say it one way, and in America, they say it another way. And that's basically what they're saying. So here in Babylonia, they would say, Tuvia chata v'zigud mangid, Tuvia sins and Zigud's going to get lashes. It's actually a case where Tuvia actually does sin and Zigud gets lashes. Why? The case is that Tuvia sins and Zigud comes forward testifying. Now, one witness by himself can't get anything done in court. So Zigud shouldn't have testified against him. It's just what we call lashon hara. It's like saying something bad about someone that has no ramifications whatsoever because you're not going to be able to convict him in court. So the rabbi actually punished Zigud for bad-mouthing Tuvia when there was nothing he could, it was a useless bad-mouthing of Tuvia. But still, it seemed very unfair that Tuvia sinned and Zigud got punished. And Hatam Amre, and this everybody knows the story of Shechem Nasiv, Shechem married Dinah, Mavgai Yazir. And all of the inhabitants of the city, there's different interpretations of what Mavgai is, whether he's an individual in the city or the whole city, and they had to circumcise themselves because of Shechem. Right. So again, you see all these people having to do something people who were innocent or had nothing to do with the whole story. And then they end up getting sort of punished. Right. And the fact they had to get circumcised and then in the end also killed. But that's this unfair. OK, so it's similar to the beginning where we said this is unfair, but it's a different kind of unfair. To which they answer again the same. Now here, this is what happens when you have two versions. Some of the details are very similar and some of them are different, but here it's the same structure. Again, the Saba is going to answer the question. And each time we had an inference, a question on the inference. In one case, it was a question from a verse. In the other case, it was a question from real life, and things we just all know to be, which is you don't get punished for a sin you didn't commit, a crime you didn't commit. So here comes Dahu Saba again, and he says the exact same words now. In other words, again, this is just two versions, so it makes sense. He ends with the same words, but it has a little bit of a different meaning because he says here, they should have asked for mercy, same wording, but what's the difference? The difference here is because they didn't ask for mercy, they're actually liable for getting killed, as opposed to in the first version, which is they'll only get killed if someone actually prays for their death, but the default is they're not going to get killed. So it's similar, but yet there's differences between these versions. Okay, so here's the chart, which kind of maps out the differences between the versions and helps you see, what each time the mothers were trying to either prevent prayers or encourage prayers, right? Either way, they were trying to keep their sons alive, but in different methods. Okay, and then you can go through this on your own. We already kind of did it, so we'll move on. That was one Gemara. Now that Gemara seems to indicate that there's some sort of punishment going on here because the Kohen Gadol is getting punished. It really looks like he's getting punished, either because he gets cursed and then the curse comes true, or because he's just deserving of punishment and maybe the prayer can help sustain him. There's a lot more to do with that sugya, and we don't have time in this class, but a whole theological discussion about does prayer really work this way? And the Gemara takes it as a clear that of course it works this way, but obviously we know that it doesn't necessarily, just because I pray doesn't mean it's actually going to happen. And that's a whole other story, another level to this whole sugya. But now we're going to move to the next Gemara on this topic. So first we're going to start with the Mishnah. And now we get to, I know some people I heard, I was one of the Chavrutot I went into, they said, seems so strange that someone could be in the Ir Miklat for one day and then get out the next day because the Kohen Gadol died. Well, in this case, you have an even more extreme case. Mishinigmar Dino, you went to the court so they could determine, was your death accidental or was it intentional? Or was it so close to onus that you don't even have to go? Whatever it is, he gets determined that he needs to go to an Ir Miklat. And he doesn't even get there. And mate Kohen Gadol. he actually doesn't even have to go to the refuge city at all. So this person has never sat in the refuge city, and he is automatically exempt, which is crazy. To which the Gemara obviously asks, my time, what is the reason for this? My time, as opposed to Menani Mile, often, although not always, is followed by a logical explanation, as opposed to Menahane Mile, which usually comes with a verse. You will sometimes see after a my time a verse. What's the reason? And they bring the reason from the pasuk, but usually it's logic. And what's tricky about logic, which is we're going to see in the sugya, is that you can flip it on its head. You can prove logic one way, and then you can totally prove it the other way. So Amar Abai, Kal v'chomer, he says, oh, this is the Kal v'chomer argument. Basically means we're going to compare one thing that's lenient, one thing that's stringent, or more severe, less severe, and we're going to learn one from the other. And it could go in either direction. Misha galak fal yatsa. Somebody who is already exiled, in other words, meaning he must be in a worse situation, he was exiled, he gets out. Misha lo gala, the one who didn't go into exile, Eino din shelo yigle. Eino din means, is it not the case that he shouldn't go to Ir Miklat? Because obviously in a better situation if he never even went to exile. To which the Gemara says, what kind of logic is that, right? It's even hard for me to convince you of that logic because it doesn't make so much sense. To which the Gemara is going to immediately reject and says, Vidilma. Dilma is perhaps. You always remember that because it sounds like dilemma, because you're not sure, right? So Dilma, maybe, hi digala ichaperle. Now here all of a sudden we get to this word that we didn't see at all last week, which was atonement. Maybe by going to the Ir Miklat, by exiling himself, he already received atonement. And hi de lo gala lo, and the one who never went to a refuge city, he never got any atonement yet. So maybe it's really what, right? Maybe you would say it's the opposite logic. And if you never went to the Ir Miklat, at least go there for a day. You didn't get any sort of atonement. You need atonement. To which the Gemara says, here's going to be our clue into the depth of the Kohen Gadol. Midi galut kamachapra. You think it's galut that does? You think it's going to the Ir Miklat that atones for you? No way, no how. Mitat Kohen hu demachapra. It's the death of the Kohen Gadol that gives you your atonement. That's a very interesting line. Very unclear what that means. How does the death of the Kohen Gadol atone for your sin? So before we move on and see what the Rishonim say, I just want to kind of do the summary question here that I put at the end here, which is the two sugiyot seem to take a different approach to why the death of the Kohen Gadol. So the first sugya really seemed to say that the Kohen Gadol is basically partially responsible. And how this exactly works is still not clear, but it seems to me like his death is viewed as a punishment. And if he's not punished, then you can't get out of the Ir Miklat because there's two of you that have to suffer, so to speak. Two of you need punishing, and until he gets killed, he doesn't get his punishment. Seems a little crazy that the Kohen Gadol should get a more severe punishment than the killer should. But again, leaders have certain responsibilities, and he didn't take care of his communal responsibilities, which again, according to the Torah, according to the Gemara, is to pray that this kind of thing didn't happen. And that's the way that sugya views it. But when you read a sugya in the Gemara, that sugya is not the whole picture. That's one opinion, one approach. According to the second sugya, it's that his death is a way of atoning for the sins of the killers. It's not that he necessarily did anything wrong, okay? But it's atonement. Now, I want you to point out one thing before we see the Rishon. Neither of these two answers relates to the whole protection element. And I know someone said in the Chavruta when I was there that shouldn't it be, if you were there for one day and then you go out, all the relatives are going to want to still kill you. If the whole purpose of being there is to protect you, well, this doesn't help you at all for that element. And neither of these sugiyot addresses it at all. And that's just interesting, okay? What's more interesting is that when we get to the Rishonim, we're going to see, I'm going to show you 4 approaches to how to understand this. And some of them are based on the Gemaras, and some of them aren't based on the Gemaras at all. And some of them kind of take, and some of them are actually commentaries on the Torah, but often commentaries on the Torah take into consideration the Gemara. And what I want to show you is that what I think is happening here is they're taking into consideration, I would say, the whole section of Gemaras that we've been seeing and the concepts that we've been seeing about, let's say, either its protection or its punishment. And some of them are basing it on the sugiyot that we saw. And some of them are basing it on other things, on other ideas and concepts that came out of other sugiyot in the Gemara, but not this at all. And that they don't take these as this is the reason, maybe because they don't identify with it and they struggle with it. But they come up with other reasons that aren't in this text of the Gemara today at all. But like I said, they were referenced in the ideas that we discussed in the previous dapim about the protection. So we are going to see those that connect it with the idea of protection, but definitely not relying on our Gemara. So the first is the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim and the Guide to the Perplexed. And he basically says here, and I'm assuming that most of you didn't get to this, so we'll try to read this inside. I'll read it in the English just for the sake of time here. He says, a person who killed another person accidentally must go into exile in order to quiet the anger of the redeeming relative. You can already see where he's going. He doesn't view our Gemaras at all. He's looking at the calming of the anger of the redeeming relative so that he doesn't see the one who caused this mishap. In other words, you have to go into exile so that you're out of sight, out of mind. They don't see you, they won't kill you. The chance of returning from exile depends on the death of the high priest. Why? Because the high priest is the most honored of men and the beloved of all of Israel. So what? By his death, the Rambam explains, the relative of the slain person becomes reconciled. Why? For it is a natural phenomenon that we find consolation in misfortune when the same misfortune or a greater one has befallen another person. It's just natural that you see someone else dying and then it calms you down about your relative who died. Say, oh, I see the tragedy happens to other people as well. And amongst us, no death causes more grief than that of the high priest, because he has to explain why the high priest and not just once someone else in the community dies. So that's how he answers the question. And he basically says the death of the high priest calms the relatives. Now we're going to see another approach like this, but with a minor variation. So he says it calms because you see someone else suffering and you realize, okay, there's suffering in this world. He died, my relative died. Okay, maybe I don't need to kill the person who did it by accident. If we move to the next source. So the next source is, is the Abarbanel. And the Abarbanel asks all the questions that we've been asking. And the Abarbanel says, it says he will sit there until the death of the Kohen Gadol. Why? Because the Kohen Gadol is an officer and a prominent person in Israel. He's holy to his God. And when he dies, the entire nation will tremble. And those who live will note that a man's day is like a passing shadow. And why should he not remove his thoughts about avenging the blood of his relative and to cut off with murder? And tomorrow the avenger himself will be in the ground. Instead of saying like the Rambam said, which is it'll make him realize, okay, I had a tragedy, he had a tragedy, it's not so bad. This is more like life is fleeting, and why should I spend my life trying to kill this relative, this guy who killed my relative? I should just really move on. And it's more this idea of how, life is short and I shouldn't spend my time just being angry at this person. And that will also appease him. So these two, if you notice, very interestingly, leave the Gemara entirely aside and ignore all that we saw about atonement and punishment and all that. And it's more that the Kohen Gadol is this symbol, like an icon, and his death will cause something to happen, either, right, with the Rambam goes or the Abarbanel. I'm not going to repeat it again, but that's their approach. The Sforno and the Shadal that we're going to see, at least one of the opinions in Shadal, is going to go back more to the Gemara, at least in this idea of the atonement and the punishment. So the Sforno says, Sforno is a commentary on the Torah. So is the Abarbanel. Until the death of the Kohen Gadol, the Torah had already made clear that exile is a penalty applicable only to inadvertently committed killing. Seeing that there are different degrees of inadvertent killing, i.e., some border on accidents totally beyond the control, whereas other are acts of criminal negligence, though unintended, the Torah, and here what the Sforno is going to get, I'll already preface this by saying, he's going to deal with our issue of how could one person be in the Ir Miklat for no days, right? Like he just got ruled, I'm supposed to go to Ir Miklat, or 5 days, and another guy 10 years, and another guy 30 years, very random. So what does he say? There's nothing random in Judaism, according to the Sforno. What does he say? And this is, you have to think about that this practically doesn't really work out, okay? But conceptually, maybe. The Torah in determining the penalty does not give us a fixed time, but a variable. When the killing occurred only a short time before the death of the high priest, the killer spends little time in the city of refuge. On the other, there may be times when the killer dies in the city of refuge before the high priest dies. These variables are taken into account by God, who alone is in possession of all the facts. And until he punishes the killer according to the degree of negligence as found in Exodus, as we saw, Valohim ina liyado, right, which was just in the parsha. It came about by an act of God. If you remember, we saw this. That was the Tosfot who quoted it, and then we saw the Gemara last time about that then the accidental murderers kill the intentional murderers and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point is that God's hand is orchestrating. And what he claims, and again, how this practically, it would be an impossibility. But what he says is that the Kohen Gadol's death is the way God determines you're going to be in there for a short time and you're going to be in there for a long time because God knows that you were intentional, so you have to stay for a really long time. And you were closer to accidental, really not your fault, you're going to stay in there a really short time. And therefore, this thing that seems arbitrary is totally not arbitrary, and it's all God's hand. Now, again, this doesn't really work out perfectly because it doesn't work that way, that the killers all kind of lined up in terms of where they were on the scale of negligent to intentional, and the timing all worked out with the death of the Kohen Gadol. But what he's trying to do is find some God orchestrating to make order out of something that seems really not in order. The Shadal brings two explanations. One, he quotes somebody else. First, he says the foreigner's explanation is correct, but not all the inadvertent killers are equal. He says at least we have to address that. And thus we cannot give them equal punishments, which will be limited by God's will. But then he suggests some other things. It's possible to say what the Mincha Belula says. This is a fascinating creative interpretation. In order to have the new Kohen Gadol loved by the nation, and that happiness should surround the nation when he arises, for the exile will return home. It's like a pardon of the king, right? The new leader, the Kohen Gadol, comes in, and that's what he says. If the Kohen Gadol dies, that means a new one comes in. The new one pardons all these people so that there can be happiness in the nation. People go back to their homes and their families and all that, which is a nice explanation, but the Shadal says this doesn't really work because it's all based on the death of the Kohen Gadol, and it could be that a few months could pass before they appoint a new one. He says it's not really. It should have then said in the Pasuk when there's a new Kohen that comes into play. But the last suggestion, he says, is that perhaps one could say that the Kohen brings atonement for inadvertent acts through the sacrifices he brings. This is a very interesting interpretation of Shadal. Shadal in general has very creative interpretations. He's an Italian scholar from not so long ago. And he says, the Kohen is the symbol of atonement. In general, Kohanim, what do? They help atone for people's mistakes. And usually mistakes are mistakes like accidental mistakes. And that's their main job. So he says, what bigger act of accident and sin than accidental murder? And what bigger Kohen than the Kohen Gadol? So he puts the two together and he says, it must be that his death brings about atonement for the most horrible sin there is of accidental sins, right? So he basically matches the Kohen Gadol and him being the symbol of atonement of his death. And that obviously connects with the Gemara that said his death is the atonement, right? It's the Kohen Gadol's death. That was the second sugya we saw. That connects it to the Kohen Gadol's death as atonement. So if we just look quickly at this chart and then we'll sum up with some of the methodological points we saw today and finish today's class. So we basically have these two approaches of the Rambam and the Barbanel, that it's all about protection. And basically the death will cease, it will cause the end of the relatives wanting to kill him, so he's free to go. And the Sforno and the Mincha Belula and the Shadal, who all basically put it in the category of punishment and need for atonement. The only one who didn't really say need for atonement was the Mincha Belula, who basically said it's a pardon. But a pardon only comes when you did a punishment, when you needed a punishment, you did something wrong. And therefore, they're siding on the punishment side. So again, the other points, okay, so let's just review. I have a long list of methodological points. I know we're beyond the time, but this is the critical part of what I'd like to get to in our class, which is just doing a quick sum up of all the different methodologies we saw in today's class. Hopefully these are all of them. Tried my best to make a good list of them. So number one, we saw different Kohanim mentioned in the Mishnah. We saw two approaches. Was it a historical thing, or was it that they could be simultaneous? And that was a whole different viewing of how Kohanim Gedolim work, right? Like when these Merubeh Begadim existed. Could it be simultaneous? And then we kind of saw that this difficulty in the Mishnah could theoretically work out if we view it that they were all simultaneous. And then I explained why the mothers were doing this, because they wanted their sons to be protected as opposed to the others. Then we saw this debate, the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda. We found the source for the debate in the Gemara, which was counting how many times it was mentioned in the verses, which again is a type of typical method, but probably not where they actually got the real halacha from. We talked about the mothers and their fears about people praying for their sons. Number one, was there a basis for their fears? The Gemara took it as clearly the mothers were right, and clearly the prayers would have worked. But we did raise as a question, which is always fair to do. The Gemara can read it one way. We have the ability to read the Mishnah in the way we want to read the Mishnah. We can also read it the way the Gemara did, but possibly we suggested that maybe their fears weren't real fears. And maybe you didn't have to take it so literally that for sure the Kohanim could die if people were to pray for their death. Then we saw two versions of the test, and each version was kind of based on a different assumption, a different base assumption. Would the Kohanim Gadolim definitely die if we did nothing, or would they only die if people prayed for their death? Still, each method had to explain what was wrong. Why did the Kohanim Gadolim do wrong? They seem to be innocent, and why would they die either which way, because people pray for them or if people don't pray to protect them? And each one led to the same answer, which was in the end, they are responsible, which again put the leaders in a very important position where they're responsible for mistakes that go on within their community. Okay, and then we talked about when you have different versions, usually things shift, but sometimes there's certain lines, sometimes they're the same, even though that one line that was the same about the Saba that was quoted meant something a little different in each place. My taima is a type of question, right? As opposed to Menahani Mile. Menahani Mile usually brings a source from the Torah. My taima usually, but not always, brings a logical explanation. And then we had a logical explanation, which was totally flipped upside down and said, oh, that logic doesn't work at all. You missed the point. And it's not the ir miklat that atones. It's the death of the Kohen Gadol that atones. We saw these two sugiyot in the end that kind of one seemed to say the Kohen's responsible because he caused the accidental murder almost because he didn't pray for mercy. And the other was that his death actually atones, not that he was responsible, but that there's something about his death that atones, which was still left very unclear. And then when we got to the Rishonim, we came up with some explanations as to why his death might atone, particularly the Shadal in the last explanation. And we saw why, how they are part of this punishment element. And then we also saw, though, some commentaries which weren't really coming out of our particular sugya at all, didn't connect at all. It was all about the relatives, which was clearly missing from our sugya, as people pointed out. But it does have basis in the other sugyot that we saw. And these concepts do come up in the Gemara. It's not like it came from out of nowhere about, and also from the verses, obviously, about the need for protection from the ir miklat. And that's what they kind of built their commentaries on. And the other last point I want to mention is something I said in the beginning, which is, I hope that you noticed in Chavruta that the more questions you ask, the better you understand the sources that you read. Because if you can anticipate the questions, it's easier to understand what it is that you're reading. Thank you for joining. We have one more class left next week. Looking forward to seeing you all there.